Today I'll be doing a relatively short review of this book. It's called the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, and you're looking at the cover. Try to keep the glare off it. Over 1,000 years older than any previously discovered biblical manuscripts. Oldest known Bible. And those are the translators and the ones that provide the commentary. Martin Abegg, Peter Flint, and Eugene Ulrich. So look at the spine. This is just a normal hardback, normal sized hardback, and it has the normal blurbs of endorsement on the back. And I wanted to show you the ISBN 10 at the top and the ISBN 13 at the bottom. I'm not sure the hardback is still available. I bought mine about 20 years ago when it came out. But I do know that there is a paperback version of it. I'm going to take this dust jacket off. So that I can show you the book. I have the dust jacket in the Brodart fold-on dust jacket cover, an archival cover to keep it safe and protected. So this is what the hardback itself looks like. It's a green. Doesn't quite feel like fabric, but it's not that slick stuff that they use these days. I think it's glued, although it kind of looks like it has signatures there. I wasn't able to find any stitching, and the way it behaves, it doesn't like to stay open, as you can see. It will not lie flat, which tells me that it's very likely a glued binding. It is 9.5 inches tall, 6 5/8 inches wide, 2 inches thick. Go inside and show you a text column. This is a typical introduction, and this is what the text itself will look like. One column of text. We're looking in Jeremiah chapter 7 here. Each column is 118 millimeters wide. There are about 83, 85-ish characters per line. And on a page with very few footnotes, I wasn't able to find a page with no footnotes on it, but you can get as many as 39 lines of text per column. Pages are 235 millimeters tall, 150 millimeters wide. That equates to 9 1/4 inches tall, 5.9 inches wide. Margins here from the top of the text column to the edge are 20 to 22 millimeters, around 19 millimeters down here from the bottom of the lowest footnote to the bottom edge of the page. The inner margin can be as much as 13 millimeters. It's quite a bit less than that here in the middle of the book. Outer margin is typically about 17 millimeters. The font is a nice 10-point font. It's shaped very similar to Times New Roman. And the line height is 4.6 millimeters, which equates to about 13 points. And so that is easy on the eyes. Very easy. Verse numbers are in the text, as you see here, inside the paragraphs. And strangely, the text is quite frequently line matched, but I'm sure it was not intentional. I think maybe here, if we could get some light behind it, we could see that it's not line matched here perfectly. So it was accidental, any line matching that occurred. There are page bottom notes, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. The page bottom notes are in about an 8.5 point font. They're easy to move from the text down to the note, but you have difficulty moving from the note back up to the text because they do not indicate the verse number. The paper is very nice. It's a typical paper from a hardback book. It's about 119 microns thick, which is roughly on the order of 108 GSM, maybe within 10% of that. It's a very flat surface, very matte, no shine at all. It's off-white in color, which helps, and there is minimal show-through, very, very little show-through. You may in places be able to get a hint of what's written on the opposite side, but not much. There are book introductions, And the book introductions are in the same size font, about a 10-point font, but this looks to be double spaced, so that's the easiest way to tell when you are in an introduction rather than in the text itself. Book titles show here at the front of the book, and then if you look later on, as you get into it, you don't see it. So if I just opened here, I wouldn't be able to tell that I was in Jeremiah unless I knew that the footnotes are written with the book title in them quite frequently. That's only because that the Dead Sea Scrolls were named with a naming convention that included the book name most of the time. So most of the time this works. You can look at the footnotes and tell which book you're in. There is no indication at the top of the page or anywhere else what the contents on that page are. You just have to look and figure it out yourself. Page numbers are in the outside corners. There are no headings in the text. Chapter numbers are in this large type font here along the edge, so those make those easy to find. So you'll know what chapter you're in, but finding out which book you're in is a little bit more difficult. All the books begin on a separate page. All the books of the Bible do. They'll begin on separate pages with their own introductions. There is at the end of the Bible, and of course this is only the Old Testament, because that's what was found in Qumran and the other locations along the Dead Sea. The end of the Bible, which ends here in this edition with the book of Tobit, it appears, the Deuterocanonical book of Tobit. There is a bibliography. And then if we turn to the front of the book, we'll see some more blurbs of advertising, endorsements from various scholars. 2 pages of that, a title page, copyright page with a dedication to all the author's children. And then my copy appears to be the second printing from 2000 itself. Table of contents, and so they have it arranged by the Torah, the prophets, and then other books. And then the bibliography we just saw. Just want to point out that they do include First Enoch here, but they do not include the text for First Enoch. They only have a short essay on it, which is in the form of a book introduction. Then we have the introduction, and we'll take a look at some of the material here in the introduction in just a moment, after I get through with the overview. So the introduction is multiple pages long, and then there's this insert about how to read this Bible, or this book, so we'll take a look at that as well after I come back. Now I have the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible open to Genesis 1, and I just want to point out some things about it. Wherever you see square brackets surrounding material, that means that material is not available in any of the Dead Sea Scrolls they used to produce this English text. So, and is missing. Was is missing. Now that doesn't mean that those words aren't necessarily in the text itself. They weren't there originally, but it does mean that they're not extant. They don't exist. We're talking about fragments that are 2,000-ish years old that were lying around in caves near the Dead Sea. So a lot of the material has been eaten by what they call cave worms. I don't know what a cave worm looks like, but they had their way with the text. So here, part of the word face is missing, and then everything until a consonantal sound in the word deep is missing there. Another thing you should notice is that occasionally there is a word in italics. Now what that indicates is that there is a variant reading, and if you remember verse 5 in your Masoretic Text-based Bible, it said God called the light day. But here they have a reading daytime, and then they have a footnote. So if we go to the bottom of the page and look at footnote 1, which is down here, we see that the reading daytime is from this scroll, 4Q, Genesis G. And then they point out that the Masoretic Text, the Samaritan Pentateuch, and the Greek Old Testament, commonly called the Septuagint, or the 70, say day. So that is how one reads the footnote. If we zoom out a little bit, you'll see that chapter 1 is based on these various scrolls. So that's what they do at the beginning of a chapter. They tell you the source scrolls that they used for their translation. If we look back up, we'll notice one other thing. You'll see this little paragraph with a gray square in front of it. It's a note about a textual variant. They point out that no variants from the scrolls have worked their way into modern Bible translations of Genesis. Footnotes 3 and 4 and verse 9, which is on the next page, manifest prime candidates. These are variations that could find their way into our translations in the future. The precursor to the Septuagint reading of gatherings, rather than the traditional Hebrew place, is found in the Dead Sea Scroll classified as 4Q Genesis H, and etc. So if we look over the next page to verse 9, we'll see what they're talking about. I'll move the camera a bit, zoom this in. Okay, and so it reads, and the waters under the heavens gathered to their gatherings, and the dry land appeared. Oh, this is the one here, note 3, into one gathering. So that's gathering instead of place. And if we go down to footnote 3, we see that this 4Q Genesis H1 and the 70 are where they're getting the word gathering from, while the Masoretic Text says place, as well as the Samaritan Pentateuch, and then one other scroll has place as well here, 4Q Genesis B. You should also notice this triangle. This triangle is one of the key reasons that you'll not likely want to bring this book to church with you. That and the fact that there is no New Testament. It indicates that there's material missing, that they don't have any scrolls that have the material after verse 28 in chapter 1. So verses 29 through 31 are missing. So you see the same thing here between verse 3 and verse 6. So verses 4 and 5 just are not still in existence in any of the scrolls. That doesn't mean that they weren't there originally, but they have decayed and disappeared over time. This is quite frequent here in the book of Genesis. For instance, we have this lacuna here between the end of chapter 8 and the beginning of 17. So there's quite a lot of material missing in the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. And now you're looking at the little essay on how to read this book, and some of this we just covered, starting with numbers on the line within the text represent verse numbers. So they're pointing down here to the 5. That's where the verse numbers are. There are explanatory comments. They're in italic font, and they are marked by this gray square, which we've seen. Square brackets surround areas lost in the scrolls due to various type of damage. And so they show here a portion of the text that's missing, which they filled in from the Masoretic Text. Continuing, let's see what's written down below. So readings from scrolls that differ from the traditional Hebrew text are printed in italics, so that's a clue to you that there's a variant involved. The triangle indicates that there's a gap in the scroll evidence of more than 2 verses before the next line. And then here, raised numbers following textual variants refer to the footnoted information at the bottom of the page. That's the kind of thing we've seen already. We're still inside how to use this book, or how to read this book. And they tell in this box what I mentioned earlier, that at the beginning of a chapter they tell you the source material, that is the scrolls that they use to try to produce the chapter. Following the chapter number are the information about the footnotes. These are the raised numbers in the main text. And then this little box tells you how to read the scroll name. So the numeral tells you the number of the cave. So 4 means cave 4 at Qumran. Q is for Qumran. And then the other information tells you what the scroll has on it. So this particular scroll has portions of Genesis and Exodus. They note that a few manuscripts come from other areas, so they use these other abbreviations for Wadi Muraba is more, and so forth. Finally, on how to read this book, there's a box here that says what I just said a moment ago. That a portion of the scroll name tells you the contents of the scroll. They also say that if the scroll is written in the ancient Hebrew script, the Paleo-Hebrew, this is also indicated. So they mean like this. 4Q Paleo is not in the more modern Hebrew, but it's in the older Hebrew characters. Ancient versions are mentioned, and they give the meaning of the abbreviations. And then they explain to you how to read footnote 1, which says on this point here, 75. So footnote 1, which has to do with whether the words here are 70 or 75. Reading 75 is found in 2 manuscripts. Those 2, 4Q Exodus B and 4Q Genesis through Exodus A. And it's also the reading in the Septuagint, but that the Masoretic Text and the Samaritan Pentateuch read 70. When I produced my notes on the Septuagint about 20 years ago now, I used this book, the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, to create an appendix to detail agreements between the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls, where those two agreed between themselves and disagreed with the Masoretic Hebrew. And part of the reason I did this is to demonstrate that Septuagint preserves ancient Hebrew readings. Online you will hear all kinds of claims being made. For instance, that the Septuagint was invented in the 4th century, or that the Septuagint, the quotations in the New Testament from the Septuagint were actually written into the Septuagint after the fact from the New Testament. And all of that strikes me as somewhat silly. Particularly the latter claim is pretty easily cast doubt upon by just examining the Septuagint versions and the New Testament versions. If the material from the New Testament was actually inserted back into the Septuagint, they did a sloppy job of it. But here's some of the agreements in Genesis, and I'll just scroll down. You can pause the video if you want to take a closer look at them, or you could go out online and look for R. Grant Jones' notes on the Septuagint, and I think you'll still find this appendix out in archives someplace. As you can see, there are quite a few of them, and I don't think I intended to be comprehensive. Down to this point, we're in Deuteronomy. So, and then afterwards I have a section where I just looked at some of the more significant agreements between Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint in the rest of the Bible. And you can see again, there are quite a few of them. Now we'll take a look at the overall introduction to the book, and I just want to point out a few things here. One of the neat things is that they have a table here with the Jewish Tanakh, the Protestant Old Testament, and the Roman Catholic Old Testament side by side, which shows you in a synoptic way how those differ. They have a bit of history on the Masoretic Text here. So if you're unfamiliar with that, this is a very good read. It's very short but informative. Then there is an article here on the Septuagint, and they point out, contrary to some King James onlyists' claim, that there are manuscripts of the Septuagint. They're fragments, but they date to the first centuries BC. And that includes Papyrus 458 from John Rylands, which dates to the 2nd century BC, and Papyrus Fuad, which is 266 from about 100 BC. So those are old Greek fragments from the BC time frame, not from the 4th century AD. This on the left shows the difference between what they believe the original form, using the more modern script of Psalm 1, and the Masoretic form, which shows you all these little annotations that are made to the consonants up here, which creates the Masoretic text. Here's a very brief history of the discovery of the scrolls. Nearly 900 manuscripts were found at Qumran. They talk about modern theory is that the community at Qumran was comprised of Essenes. Then here they talk about the biblical scrolls. Dead Sea Scrolls include more than 225 biblical manuscripts, 215 found at Qumran, with a few exceptions, including the famous Isaiah scroll, and then 11 PS, the Psalm scroll. Almost all these manuscripts are fragments. Then they talk about their philosophy in terms of the procedures they use in order to build this book. Some of this we've already seen. I mentioned earlier that although 1st Enoch does not appear in the Dead Sea Scrolls Bible, they do have an introduction for it. They say it appears elsewhere, so they didn't want to take up space and make this volume too large. But 1st Enoch does have fragmentary evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a copy of the Nickelsburg and VanderKam translation of 1st Enoch, and this artwork on the cover is in fact a fragment from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Flip over to the copyright page, you'll see that it says the photograph is of 4QENC. So it comes from the 4th cave, and it's the Book of Enoch, and it's the 3rd scroll on Enoch here. So that's what it kind of looks like, the fragmentary evidence. Now the introduction does make a few points of interest. It says the typical Book of Enoch before the Dead Sea Scrolls was broken into these 5 sections. The Qumran manuscripts apparently have more interest in the offspring of angels and humans, Genesis 6, and it becomes a unit of its own right, the Book of Giants. And then see, what else do they say that I want to point out? The caves have 20 manuscripts of Enoch, all of them in Aramaic. And one of the things people were somewhat hopeful of is that these scrolls of Enoch would give some clue as to the background of the New Testament use of Son of Man for Jesus, but unfortunately the portions of Enoch that feature that messianic character with that name have not been found among the scroll fragments. So it gives rise to the speculation that the New Testament influenced the final form of 1st Enoch rather than the reverse, and then they give their reason for not including the text here. It's available elsewhere, and it's somewhat speculative to include it in the work called a Dead Sea Scrolls Bible. Now, just in the very next page is the introduction to Daniel. And there are a few things of interest here. This will give you a feel for the kind of information you'll find in the typical book introduction. They tell you that 8 manuscripts of Daniel were found at Qumran. They talk about whether those scrolls back up the Protestant or the Catholic version of Daniel, and it turns out they say that 7 of the 8 back up the Protestant version, and then 1 scroll has only Daniel's prayer from chapter 9. So there is no evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls for the longer version of Daniel. At least that's the way I'm reading this. They point out that, in fact, Daniel in the scrolls is written in both Hebrew and Aramaic, just like our modern ones. Those of you viewers who like to make fun of me for mispronouncing words, there's another one. And is there anything interesting here? Oh, they mentioned this document called the Florilegium, which is a non-biblical work, but it refers to Daniel as a prophet. So they take that as evidence that Daniel was included among the prophets and not among the writings. Apparently later Jewish organizations of the Bible had Daniel among the writings rather than the prophets. We'll turn the page to the next page of the introduction. It's a little hard to manipulate. If it would lie flat, it would be a little better, but as it is, it does not. Talking about some textual variants here, there's one at 7:1 where the Masoretic Text has a phrase, "He related the sum of the words," and it's completely absent from 4Q Daniel B. And that the New Revised Standard Version truncates the line in accordance with 4 Daniel B and against the Masoretic Hebrew. And then there's another one that they mention, Daniel 10:16, where the NIV mentions the Dead Sea Scrolls variant in a footnote, but retains the Masoretic text and the book itself. And there are other interesting things here. They, of course, believe that Daniel was written at the late date. So that's about it. I hope this is a relatively short review, at least short for me as compared to my typical one. And I just want to point out that this, of course, is not the sort of Bible that you would probably want to take with you to church. You may not want to read it devotionally. But it is a very useful reference work because it tells you what the extant portions of the Dead Sea Scrolls do say, gives you that in English that you and I can read. We don't have to be Hebrew experts with access to fragments themselves. And it gives us all this information in the footnotes, which shows how the Dead Sea Scrolls differs from what's in the Masoretic text that we've inherited and which is usually used in our Bibles today. So just like the New Testament, which has numerous textual variants, there are variants in the ancient Hebrew material, and there's a challenge there in terms of determining what the original text was. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope it does turn out to be relatively brief. Thanks for watching, and please encourage you to like and share, not like and share, like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much.